talk, and what I want to talk to you about, and I'll probably spend the next 40 minutes or so talking about this, and I want to leave some time for audience interaction because there will probably be a whole range of questions and issues that you might want to discuss and raise based on what I've said. Uh, sorry. Okay. And this is so what I'm broadly going to cover is going to be the Citizenship Amendment Act. Some of you may remember this as a Citizenship Amendment Bill, which has now become a law, and therefore it is the Citizenship Amendment Act. I'm going to talk about what this act actually says. I think there is a lot of confusion and misrepresentation on what this act actually says. And I sort of want to talk about why I believe this particular law is unconstitutional. After that, I want to go into a related but slightly separate issue, which is the National Population Register and the National Register of Citizens. In this particular aspect, I want to talk about what this actually entails. What does the legal framework and structure for an NPR and an NRC actually state? Again, there is a lot of misrepresentation and confusion swirling around about these concepts and ideas. And I want to look at the legal framework to clarify what these two are and what are the sources of problems about these things. And that sometimes maybe the more devastating argument against this is the more complex argument and not the simple argument that a lot of people have made. So what I want to hopefully leave you with today is an understanding of how these particular laws will affect people and why they're being opposed and why they should be opposed, and not just in terms of how much they might affect the material well-being of people or what difficulties and troubles they may impose on any one section or multiple sections of society, but also why the challenge should be about the principles which these laws represent and why we should resist them that way. Let me start off by referring to a quote, since we're in Jai Bhim Bhavan, of Dr. I'll paraphrase the quote of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar in the Constituent Assembly. When he was finalizing the provisions relating to citizenship, he said that it was the provision which had given them the most headache apart from another one. They have looked at multiple drafts, they had deleted and reworked and reframed and rephrased, and finally the provisions relating to the citizenship under the Constitution as we have them now were the result of perhaps some of the most deep deliberations and discussions and also disputes within the Constitution. You have to keep in mind that when they drafted this provision, India was undergoing an upheaval in terms of partition. There were a lot of people who we were not sure will stay in India, but we couldn't deny citizenship to them. There were a lot of people who had left India, and we weren't sure if they were coming back, but we didn't want to deny citizenship to them. So the exercise that was carried out, the provisions that we have relating to citizenship in the Constitution, is the result of a lot of brainstorming, a lot of thinking about how to make the process as inclusive as possible, how to ensure that everyone who wants to be a citizen of India is allowed to be a citizen of India. The actual provisions which say who is a citizen of India come from the Citizenship Act. The Citizenship Act was passed in 1955, and the original provision, Section 3, has been amended a couple of times. Now, the original provision followed the principle of jus soli, right, which means that any person who's born on the soil of India would be a citizen of India. Those of you who may be familiar with other countries would know the US is one of the other countries in the world which also follows this principle. There they had to do it specifically in the aftermath of the US Civil War, because a lot of African Americans who had been freed and who had become free as a result of the war needed to be granted citizenship, and you couldn't obviously ask them for papers or history or documentation. You had to say that if you were born here and if you were brought in here, you'd be considered a citizen of the United States. So India followed this principle up till 1987. And I'll mention 1987, it's a significant year for another reason, which is also the year that the Assam Accords were entered into. I'll come to the Assam Accords specifically when I talk about the NRC and its implications. But keep in mind that in 1987, the law was amended. The law was amended to say that if you were born after 87, you would have to show that at least one of your parents was a citizen of India, if you want to be a citizen of India. So till 50 to 87, if you were born in India, you would be a citizen of India, with some exceptions like those on diplomatic missions and so on. And from 87 onwards, you had to show that at least one of your parents was a citizen of India. In 2003, this underwent a further change. A lot of people attribute it to the 2002 Parliament attacks and the hysteria surrounding that. It was also amended to say that not only should one of your parents be a citizen of India, the other parent should not be an illegal migrant. Okay? An illegal migrant is specifically defined under the law, which is any person who has come to India not following the Passport Act and various other legislations. We keep this definition of an illegal migrant in mind when we move on to the next stage of what does the Citizenship Amendment Act therefore do. Okay, so we now have a clear idea of who is a citizen of India. Depending on when you were born, just the fact that you were born in India between 50 to 87 that matters. Just the fact that one of your parents is a citizen of India matters between 87 to 2003. And since 2003, you have to show one parent was a citizen and the other parent is not an illegal migrant. What has the Citizenship Amendment Act done? It has done three major things. There are a couple of other minor things which are not relevant for our discussion, but I'll mention these three major things. The first thing that it has done is change the definition of an illegal migrant. So a certain class of people have been picked out by the Citizenship Amendment Act and are considered no longer illegal migrants in India. Okay, so we had said an illegal migrant is somebody who has come to India and overstayed their passport visa or come without a passport or a visa, and this has been happening for a long time. For whatever reason that you come through, you're considered an illegal migrant under the Citizenship Act. An illegal migrant who meets 4 requirements are now deemed to be not illegal migrant under the Citizenship Amendment Act. The 4 specific requirements are: they should be from one of 3 countries, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Bangladesh. They should not belong to Islam or even atheist for that matter. There's a list of religions set out there: Hindus, Sikhs, Parsis, Jains, Buddhists, and Christians. You should belong to one of these religions. Third requirement is you should have come to India on the basis of an exemption or you should be staying in India rather. You should be staying in India on the basis of an exemption provided by the central government under the Passports Act and also the Foreigners Act. Keep in mind that if somebody is an illegal migrant, the government is entitled to take you to court and have you deported. But for a certain category of people, the government has given exemptions. The government has given exemptions to say, all right, we understand that you're probably fleeing some sort of religious or political persecution in your country, and we will not evict you from India, or we will not deport you from India, because obviously you can't be sent back to that country. So you've been given the exemption under the Passport Act to stay in India. A fourth criteria, and also it seems trivial, but it's a very important aspect. You should have come to India before 31st of December 2014. Okay? So if you meet these 4 criteria under the Citizenship Amendment Act, you will no longer be a illegal migrant. That means if you're a Hindu from Pakistan who came to India and stayed here on the basis of an exemption given by the central government, but provided you came to India before 31st December 2014, you will not be deemed to be an illegal migrant. What is the implication of that? You can now apply for citizenship. You can now apply for citizenship because apart from being born in India, the other way of course, becoming a citizen of India is by naturalization, that you spent a certain number of years in India, that you have stayed here legally and voluntarily, and therefore, subject to meeting certain requirements, you can become a citizen of India. For those people who are no longer deemed illegal migrants under the Citizenship Amendment Act, a special procedure has been laid down in Section 6B. Okay, so they don't follow the regular naturalization procedure, which is laid down in Section 7 of the Act. they follow a special procedure under section 6B. So this particular set of people have to apply under section 6B. They have to meet the larger requirements, but they have to apply. One reason why this is they have to apply is again because of the Assam Accords, which said that anyone who came to India, specifically to Assam post 1971, would have to be removed. So to avoid conflict between those two provisions, they introduced a separate scheme for those who came to India illegally post 71 and therefore can be naturalized under section 6B. So this is the second major thing that the Citizenship Amendment Act does, which is that those it deems to be legal migrants, it now gives a special procedure to become a citizen. Okay, so only these people who meet these 4 criteria listed out are now given a procedure to become a citizen. The third and final thing that it does is to it reduces the number of years that you have to be in India to apply for citizenship. It was 11 years for everyone else, it is now 5 years for them. So these are the 3 major things it does in the context of citizenship. It picks out a certain category of illegal migrant, it gives them a special procedure, and it gives them a certain relaxation. Okay, it gives them a certain relaxation in the requirements. Now, what is the purpose of this? One way to look at this is that the BJP promised this in their manifesto in 2014 and they're simply fulfilling their manifesto promise. Obviously, this can't be a reason for legislation alone. You have to provide a larger public purpose. What is the larger public purpose that you're serving? The government on record, and I'm referring to the Parliamentary Joint Committee report, which came out in the year 2016 or 17, I think it was 2018. Which examined the previous draft of the bill and pointed out certain difficulties, asked the Ministry of Home Affairs what is the purpose of this bill. They said this was to protect refugees who are fleeing religious persecution from other countries. To which a member asked pointedly, then why don't the words religious persecution appear anywhere in this bill? And it's also true today. The words religious persecution don't appear anywhere else in this particular act, the Citizenship Amendment Act. The way it has changed the Citizenship Act, it has not introduced any term like religious persecution or any such thing. It has just said that these 6 or 7 communities from these 3 countries, provided they meet the other 2 requirements, will be allowed to apply. So which once again begs the question, what is the purpose of this act? The reason why I ask is because what this act effectively does is that it introduces religion as a test for citizenship. This goes fundamentally against Article 14 of the Constitution of India. I would say this also goes against the basic structure of the Constitution of India. And I will elaborate on these 2 arguments in a little bit detail. How does it go against Article 14 of the Constitution of India? Article 14 says that everyone, all persons, shall be entitled to equal treatment before the law and equal protection of the law. So it's not as if only citizens are entitled to equal treatment before the law in India. Everyone is. Whether you're a legal or an illegal migrant, whether you're a company, whether you're an entity, whether you're a foreigner, whatever you are, you're entitled to equal treatment before the law. What does that mean? Now, obviously, equal treatment doesn't mean that the law applies in exactly the same way to everyone. Right? Equality doesn't mean that the rich have as much right as the poor to sleep under the bridges and starve to death. That's not what equality means. So, doctrinally, what the Supreme Court of India has said is that laws can provide for classification, which means, and to take a common example used, the law can say that we will reserve a certain number of seats for scheduled caste, scheduled tribe and OBC employees. The law can say that we will provide the age of consent for men as 21 and for women as 18. The law can say that Hindus will be guided by the Hindu Marriage Act, the Muslims will be guided by the Shariat Act, the Christians by the Christian Marriage and Divorce Act, and so on and so forth. Classification is permitted under the law. Laws can't function without classification. But when does classification become discrimination? When there is no basis to make a classification. And the basis for making the classification has no relation to the object of the act. Let me give you an example. Suppose the government puts out an advertisement saying that only men with red hair need to apply for, will be allowed to apply for this position of a teacher of a primary school. Alright? Two questions obviously come to the fore. Why only men and why only men with red hair? Obviously, red haired men and black haired men have nothing to do with the larger aim of education, and therefore it is obviously discriminating. That if a person with black hair were to apply, to be denied, this would be a law which is clearly discriminatory. But why men only? Because then the government could say that this is a boys only hostel. We need somebody who can be a warden for the boys hostel. This position requires the person to stay overnight, will be required to stay in the premises, and we think men are better suited for this, and therefore we want only men. We could replace men with women and say this is a person who will be warden of the girls hostel, will be the person who will have to meet this requirement, and therefore we want only women. There is a purpose, there is a rational differentiation. You are saying there is a difference between men and women. There is a reason why the difference has been made for the purpose of the legislation. Now, I don't want to discuss specific case now, but I'm giving you a hypothetical to illustrate at what point a classification, making a difference between two people, can become discrimination. When there is no real basis for this difference, and when that difference has nothing to do with the overall scheme of the legislation, it becomes discrimination. It becomes a violation of Article 40. Now let's come back to the Citizenship Amendment Act. Under the Citizenship Amendment Act, you have picked out 6 or 7 communities. You have picked out 3 countries. And you have said, only they can apply. Okay? Only they can apply for citizenship. Let's for the moment assume that the other 2 requirements of coming to India prior to 31st December 2014 and the Passport Act, let's assume that they're perfectly fine. My argument has always been, and my argument remains, that these 2 criteria are itself discriminatory. The government cannot say that we will pick and choose which communities and which people to give citizenship to. If somebody applies and meets the requirements of the Citizenship Act, they should be given citizenship. You can't say if you are a Muslim from Pakistan, you cannot be allowed to apply. You can't say that if you're a Hindu from Sri Lanka who's fleeing persecution, you can't be allowed to apply. You can't say if you're a Rohingya from Myanmar fleeing persecution, you can't be allowed to apply. If the basis for picking these 6-7 communities from these 3 countries is religious persecution, the government has not put anything on record to say why it has not extended this as a matter of principle to all communities. There is a difference here, and I want to point out one aspect here. Whether to let someone into the country or not, that is a sovereign function. It may need to be decided on a case-to-case basis. It may be needed to decide. So, for example, India may say we will let all Tibetans enter the country. But citizenship is a matter of right. Citizenship is a matter of a constitutional right. You cannot deny people citizenship once they're in this country. You can't say we will create pathways to citizenship for people on the basis of religion and not for others only on the basis of religion. You can't say we will give pathways to citizenship only on the basis of specified countries and not for other countries. That is as far as Article 14 itself is concerned. There is no distinction, in my view, between somebody who's fleeing religious persecution, and I'm not even saying I want to expand the scope to political persecution. Let's just keep it to religious persecution for the moment. Rohingyas in Myanmar, you could even say Ahmadiyas in Pakistan, potentially Shias in Pakistan, maybe even atheists in Bangladesh. You cannot say that simply because we consider them quote-unquote Muslims, therefore we will not give them citizenship, or we will not even allow them to apply for citizenship. That is what this law is doing, and that is why, in my view, it is unconstitutional for violating Article 14. I will very briefly mention why I think it's against the basic structure. The basic structure of the Constitution are the set of principles that lie at the very core of the Constitution that can't even be amended out of existence. These set of principles sometimes are traced to the preamble of the Constitution itself and are sometimes traced to a set of provisions in the Constitution. But rest assured, secularism is one of those principles. And secularism is misrepresented grossly in many fora and many media. But for the purpose of the Constitution, secularism very simply means that the state will not discriminate between citizen and citizen on the basis of their religion. That the state will not itself have a religion. The state will not promote any one particular religion. The state will not follow any particular religion. In saying that only Hindus, Sikhs, Parsis and so on are allowed to apply for citizenship, what the state, the Indian state is doing through the Citizenship Amendment Act is introducing religion into citizenship. And this is the problem that attacks at the root of secularism. If you're going to say who is an Indian citizen or not an Indian citizen depends on their religion, you have fundamentally attacked the most core principle of our Constitution, which is secularism. It may not be that, and again, this is a point that has been made in the Parliamentary Committee report and has been said in a lot of other places. Of course, no existing Indian citizen, whatever her religion, is affected today because of the Citizenship Amendment Act. But the principle of it matters. The principle that we will never discriminate on the basis of religion when it comes to citizenship is worth defending and fighting for. And when the government passes a law which says that we will decide this on the basis of religion, it is attacking the principle. It doesn't matter if today only 31,000 are affected. Tomorrow the government could pass a law saying that only children born of these 7 communities will be given citizenship. Tomorrow the government may extend that backwards and say that their parents will also do citizenship. Once you compromise on the principle, there's no point fighting on the price. The principle here is worth fighting for, the principle is worth defending. That no distinction will be made on the basis of religion when it comes to citizenship. And therefore, when a law makes such a discrimination, makes such a distinction on the basis of religion, just for the purpose of citizenship, it is not only violative of Article 14, it is also against the basic structure of the Constitution. So this is what the CAA is, and this is why the CAA should be opposed. Because it is not the end point. If you take the larger theme of a Hindu Rashtra or a in India for Hindus alone, this is the first step towards it. This is not by any way just a measure of charity being given to some 31,000 unfortunate souls who find themselves in this country. Of course, they should be protected, they should be entitled to the full protection of Indian laws and the Constitution. But a worldview which says that anybody who needs this protection will be given only if they are of the right religion and from the right country is something that is untenable under our Constitution. It is something that can simply not be accepted. Coming now to the NPR and the NRC. Let me first start by clarifying what these two things are. The National Population Register is just a list of everyone who is a resident in India. Okay? So anyone who's been in India for a period of about 6 months or so will find themselves on this register. This exercise has been carried out twice before. In fact, the rules for the National Population Register was brought into effect in 2003. As I said, around the same time as the Citizenship Act was amended in 2003 to introduce the requirement of having at least one parent who is not an illegal migrant. So, this procedure was introduced in 2003. It was implemented for the first time in 2010, and an updation exercise was carried out in 2015. Nothing has happened since. You have an actual register of people who are residing in India. Now the government says that it wants to update this register in 2020. That this will happen alongside the census. Now if the exercise of 2010 and 2015 were to be repeated, there would be no reason for anyone. Because after all, it is just the list of people who are residing in India. No legal consequences follow. If you're not there, you're not there. It just means you're not a resident of India, but residency is a fact. It is a fact that I'm here standing in front of you. It is a legal consequence whether what I'm saying is defamation or sedition and so on and so forth. So if your name is not on that list, it doesn't really matter. You can always be added on to it. But what has caused concern for people is that they're now asking for information on date of birth, place of birth, and parents' date of birth and parents' place of birth. Now again, link this back to section 3 of the Citizenship Act. Again, if this register just collected this information, it makes no difference. It's just nice for the government to know, it's probably interesting for us to give, but that's it. But there is something else within these rules of 2003, the citizenship rules of 2003, which is the real source of worry, which is the National Register of Indian Citizens. Again, now that I've mentioned the National Register of Indian Citizens, let me make an important distinction here. The exercise that was carried out in Assam was not a National Register of Indian Citizens. It was a regime that was specific to the state of Assam. This rule was introduced in 2009. In 2009, the government introduced rules to implement the Assam Accords. In 1987, following the agitation in Assam, the All Assam Students Union, an accord was entered into where the government agreed that all the people who had come to India post 71 would be identified and quote unquote removed. Except that the procedure which was supposed to be followed, at least for the first step of identification, was supposed to be a National Register of Citizens. Again, it wasn't introduced for the first time in 87. An earlier National Register of Citizens was carried out in 1951 in Assam to address exactly this concern. I don't want to go specifically into the history of Assam and the colonial reasons why people in Assam feared that their language and their culture would get wiped out by demographic change. But in 1951, an exercise was carried out listing out all the residents of Assam who would get to be citizens of India. Under the Assam Accords, what the government said was that everyone who came to India from 51 to 71, legally or illegally, would be given citizenship, they would be deemed to be citizens. But post 71, they would not. Now, if in 1987, this exercise of identification had happened, we might have had some solution to the issue by now. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. The exercise happened in 2009. The NRC in Assam happened from 2009. It started off in 2009. But it really picked up speed when the Supreme Court oversaw it in 2014. Because even the government found the first time when they tried, it caused so much problem and so much trouble for so many people, they backed off. But the Supreme Court said, no, you've entered into these accords, you have made these rules, you have to implement it. There are a couple of differences between the regime that applies in Assam with regard to NRC and the NRIC, which applies to the rest of India. Okay, so for the moment, let us not use the word NRC because it can cause confusion. I will call what happened in Assam NRCA, which is the NRC of Assam, and I will call what is provided for in the 2003 rules as the NRIC. It has never been implemented. Okay, under the NRCA, every person has to apply to be a citizen of India. So of Assam's 3.3 crore people, everyone, and for those who couldn't personally, the head of the family had to apply saying, here we are citizens of India. There was a specific cutoff date, 1971, which means for Assam and Assam alone, you had to show that you are related to somebody who was in India before 1971. Either your name, your ancestor's name should have been in the 1951 list, or their name should have been in any electoral roll from 51 to 71, and therefore you're a legitimate citizen of India. Now obviously things have gone horribly wrong, because what has happened is that 2 million people, or about 20 lakh people, have been left out of this list. And even though official breakups aren't given yet, all the reports on the ground suggest more than 50% are women. At least 2 to 3 lakh are tribal populations of Assam. Isn't this ridiculous? That native, indigenous, Assamese tribal peoples, for whose benefit this was supposed to be undertaken, have themselves been left out of the National Register of Citizens. And at least 40 to 50% are Bengali Hindus. Your ability to get yourself on that list has nothing to do with whether you're an actual citizen of India or not. Whether you're educated, whether you have money, whether you have resources, whether you have the time, whether you have the ability, that is what has determined whether you can be on the list, and not whether your actual legal status is a citizen of India. Keep in mind, this exercise had been done in the past. There, people are constantly on the need, because it's also an AFSPA state, because this is also a state which has seen a lot of insurgency. People are used to keeping their documents with them. People know the importance of keeping the documents with them. Imagine if this was replicated in the rest of India. I'm seeing some figures, people doing a little bit of speculation. My own personal view on this is 95% of India's population will not be able to prove that they're Indian citizens. If the procedure followed in Assam is followed, 95% of India will not be able to show that they're Indian citizens. A latest figure which came out yesterday, I think, showed that even for those born since 2014, only 68% had birth certificates. Okay, and if you go further back, even fewer had birth certificates. Remember, these are the only valid documents that will show that you're a citizen of India. Everything else is a consequence. This is a recording of fact. And the fact of your birth is what gives you citizenship. Your passport is a consequence of citizenship. Your voter ID card is a consequence of being on the electoral roll. Being on the electoral roll is a consequence of you being a citizenship. So none of these can be used to prove that you're a citizen of India. So if an exercise like the NRC in Assam is repeated in India, you will not actually find any infiltrators. You will not find any citizens of India. So, keeping this in mind, this is why something like that cannot and should not be repeated in India. But NRIC, as I mentioned, has slightly different provisions. The NRIC says that on the basis of the National Population Register, you will be added to the National Register of Citizens. But there is a date where it is announced. You will be given a certain period of time. You will be told what documents to produce, what not to produce. Now, obviously, it may not be the exact same procedure as laid out in the NRC in Assam, but you can be guaranteed that if the Assam procedure is anything to be followed, all the citizens of this country are in for a horrible time. Because it is not any one central agency looking at this. Every local registrar is looking at this, which means your future will be in the hands of the local person in power. Have you kept that person happy? I hope you have not picked any fights with them. I hope they don't like your property too much. Because tomorrow, if that person decides that you're a doubtful citizen, you're in for a torrid time. Because, of course, you can file appeals, of course, you can go to court. But how many years are you going to litigate to show something that you have taken for granted for so long in your lives? Something as basic as citizenship, which is the only thing every Indian, no matter what family they are born into, is born with a birthright. How are you going to be able to prove this? How are you going to be able to show it? Apart from just the, practical difficulties, what I have mentioned are the practical difficulties. Even with NRC, Assam, the government has said, or rather government and the courts have said, no, you have to be declared a foreigner by a tribunal, then you can appeal to the High Court, then you can go to the Supreme Court, and until then nobody will be removed. That's just taking care of one practical difficulty. And in Assam there was a reason to do it. We may debate that reason. That reason requires people from Assam to have a longer discussion about it. But what is the reason for doing this? What is the reason for preparing a National Register of Indian Citizens? Is there any coherent set of reasons given out by anyone in power? Forget about the present regime. Was there anyone in 2003 who explained why we need a National Register of Citizens? Was there anyone in 2009 who explained why we need a National Register of Indian Citizens? Was there anybody in 2013, 14, whenever the topic has come up for discussion, has anyone explained why we need a National Register of Indian Citizens? The relationship between the citizen and the state is being fundamentally redefined. The state exists to serve us. We don't exist to, it's not our job to prove our existence to the state. It's for the state to find out who we are, what we do, how it best can serve us. And that has been the basis of constitutionalism. The basis of constitutionalism is that one, the state's powers are limited, and two, the state exists to serve us. We don't exist to meet the state's needs. We don't exist, we don't have to prove ourselves that we are innocent for any national security or other purpose. A national register of Indian citizens is not just an attack on any one community. I am 100% sure that all communities will be equally affected by it, will find it equally distasteful, and I would argue is an attack on the dignity of every single citizen of India. Why do I have to prove that I am an Indian citizen before you? The law gives me that right to be a citizen of India. If there is any doubt, there is a procedure, and you show why there should be a doubt for any one particular person. Why should an entire nation of 1.3 billion people prove that they are worthy of recognition by their own government? This is the fundamental unjustness and unconstitutionality of something like the NRIC. Keep in mind, we still don't know what is the implication of not being on the NRIC. Does it mean that you're no longer a citizen of India? Because there's an existing procedure where you can lose citizenship. You can give up citizenship for another country, or if you've been given citizenship by naturalization, and if you've done something, the government can take away citizenship from you. But nowhere does the rule say what happens if I'm not on the list. Are all the 90-95% of people going to have to go to a foreigners tribunal set up across the country and once again trying to prove their citizenship? Are the courts going to be clogged for the next 200 years trying to decide all these hundreds and thousands and millions of cases? What happens to the electoral rules? What happens to the basic delivery of public welfare and services? Are we essentially going to give up whatever progress we have made in 70 odd years for this foolish and pointless quest of trying to prepare some national register of Indian citizens, which nobody can explain what purpose it serves? I'm 100% sure that not one illegal will be identified on the basis of this. The government seems to think that this will help in identifying illegal migrants. But if they look at their own data, if they look at their own practice on the ground, illegal migrants who have come to India and who have wanted to merge with the population have obtained all the necessary documents. They will absolutely be able to show that they are citizens of India. It is those who took their citizenship for granted, who thought they're protected by laws, they're protected by democracy, they're protected by the constitution, they're the ones who are going to suffer. And what are you putting people through this suffering for? There's no reason to. So, in this context, I would like to say that on their own terms, a CAA is unconstitutional and against the basic structure of the constitution. And an NRIC, which tries to make each Indian citizen prove their citizenship, unconstitutional and an attack on the dignity of the individual. We don't need to connect the two. In fact, there is no connection between the two. There are two different kinds of attacks on the idea of citizenship in India. One tries to make it distinguishable on the basis of religion, or rather discriminatory on the basis of religion. The other changes the nature of the power relationship between the citizen and the state. That is, the state somehow trying to hold us accountable for who we are rather than the other way around. And that goes fundamentally against what constitutionalism is. I'd like to end my speech by referring to one of the finest books written about India in the last few years. It is written by an Israeli scholar. Her name is Ornit Shani. She actually recently won the Kamaladevi Chattopadhyaya Award at the Bangalore Literature Festival, so for those of you who may have been there. And I would urge all of you to immediately pick up her book. Her book is called How India Became Democratic. And it's a most fascinating story because we all take for granted that our names will be on the electoral list. If someone is not, we'll go complain, we'll go to the local election officer, somebody will help us get on the list, somebody will get deleted. But nobody has ever thought, or at least until Ornit wrote her book, nobody ever wondered how did the first electoral rolls in India get prepared. Keep in mind, there were elections before 1952. But they were all very limited electorates. The British had said you have to serve in the armed forces, have so much income, so much property, etc., 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 before you could vote. And forget about princely states, where there were not elections anyway. Nobody had told the story of how the first electoral rolls were prepared. And you'd think, what is there? There must be some bureaucrats who sat in Delhi, who sat in various state capitals, who went about the task. But Ornith actually went and looked for the records in the archives of the correspondence which took place between the Secretariat of the Constituent Assembly. Keep in mind, all of this happened before, when I started this speech, the quote that Dr. Ambedkar had said, all of this was happening before the definition of citizenship was completed in India. All of this was happening before universal suffrage was written into our constitution. All of this was happening before our constitution even came into force. In those 3 years, when the Constituent Assembly was sitting and debating our constitution, a group of bureaucrats took it upon themselves to say, no, you know what, India is going to become a democratic secular republic with universal suffrage. We now have to find a way of making that a reality. All right? The political support for that was there, but how to make it a reality? So you will see in this book how this group of people who had just the other day been working with the colonial government, how they took it upon themselves to create the first electoral rolls. And what's remarkable about it is that they wanted to make sure not one person was left out. The vision in preparing these electoral rolls was that not one person was left out. And when they started putting people's names, somebody asked, what about people who are sleeping on the streets? How will we give them an address for them? How will we identify a house for them? What about people who sleep in different houses each night because they have nowhere else to go? How do we find them? They found solutions for that. They didn't say this is too difficult, how many people are there, 10,000, no, forget about it. They never said that. You will see that they went painstakingly, district by district, city by city, town by town, village by village, to say how can we make sure no person is left out. That is what made India democratic. This approach, this belief that we have to include every last person. The idea that India's democracy only survives because every last person is included, and if they are not included, it's not because we don't want them, but maybe something got in the way. The idea that every last person is included is what comes across in this book. And I urge you all to please go ahead and read this, because you'll never read a book about bureaucratic correspondence which will make you really feel for India's democracy. And when the state turns this idea on its head, when it says that we don't care who's included, who's excluded, we will decide who will be on this list, and we don't care who's excluded, and our goal is to exclude people, that is when you're attacking not just India's constitution but the very idea of India's democracy. So to conclude, the greatest achievement of India in the last 70 years is not economic growth, education, health, maternal mortality. All of those are wonderful things. They're all great indicators. Nobody said we shouldn't have them. The single greatest achievement is that on the day the Indian Republic was born, it guaranteed universal suffrage and it guaranteed everyone's citizenship. No other country of this size ever in the history of the world has done it on the first day it was born. And you think about how poor, how war ravaged, how conflict-ridden, how unequal and how dispossessed people in the society were. The fact that our constitution framers took such a big gamble, that is one thing to be truly proud of. And something like the CAA or something like the NRIC fundamentally affects one of the proudest achievements of India's democracy. Thank you.